Hej och välkommen till Internationell författarscen Göteborg. I'm sitting here with Amitav Ghosh, or we are in different countries, but here together. My name is Ruth Elliott Blomqvist. I'm a PhD student in English literature. I'm very happy to be here with Amitav Ghosh today because for me, at least, he's a very important thinker when it comes to environmental justice and how to understand the social, political and cultural dimensions of climate change.
Hello, Elliot. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't be in Gothenburg today, but it's great to be participating in this.
So Amitav Ghosh is an Indian writer who was born in Calcutta, or Kolkata, as it's more recently been renamed in English. And he grew up in India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. Amitav, you're now living in the US, in New York, at least according to your website.
Yes.
But you've also returned to India several times to work on writing projects. So one could maybe say that at least for a while you've been living between the US and India, like the protagonist of Gun Island, one of the books we're going to talk a bit about today. You've written books, both fiction and non-fiction books, about topics like literature and society, cultural history in different parts of the world. Many novels deal with themes like colonial and post-colonial political and cultural history, in particular about India. But his recent work has been connecting these themes to the theme of climate change as well. And it's two of these later books that we're going to talk about today. Gun Island and the Great Derangement. And to make things feel a bit more physical, even though it's online, I'm just gonna hold actual books in my hands. Gun Island is a novel, and The Great Derangement is a book of essays, you could say, or one long essay. So stories of different kinds play a big part in Gun Island, from the legend that the novel revolves around to media reports from an operation to save refugees on the Mediterranean. And I think Gun Island as a whole is in many ways a story about climate change and ecological change and what this means for humans and for other species. But in the other book, The Great Derangement, you write about how climate change is hard for the novel and mainstream Western culture to represent. You consider the novel to revolve around the regularity of bourgeois life, and that everything disrupting such regularity doesn't make for a credible and serious story, according to mainstream cultural conceptions, at least. So I was wondering, how did you go about composing Gun Island with this in mind? Is it an impossible novel?
That's an interesting question. Look, I mean, I think this present moment, what we are seeing in the world, does present all kinds of imaginative challenges. And more than that, I would say it presents technical challenges in terms of writing a novel. Because, you know, the fundamental way that a novel sort of unfolds is through scenes. You know, when you try and sort of capture one setting or one scene. And I think, you know, when you have the sorts of events that we have today, these sort of very strange, uncanny events that are happening all around us, they're very difficult to represent in a scene, you know, very difficult to represent realistically. You know, how do you represent, for example, what's happening in California right now, you know? In California, it's no longer mega fires. Now they have giga fires. You know, you have fire tornadoes. You have these extraordinary things that are happening all around the world. One thing I would say, though, is that, you know, I think limiting this present crisis to climate change is really to, it's to narrow the horizon too much, because actually it's not just climate change, it's everything change. Everything is changing all around us. So I think rather than talking about the climate crisis, we should really talk about a planetary crisis, because, and the pandemic shows this more clearly than anything else. I mean that everything that we took for granted in these last 20, 30, 40 years has been upended. It's been stood on its head. I mean, if you think that 30 years ago, doctors were boasting that they've done away with viruses altogether, that the virus as a form has been defeated, and we see that nothing was defeated. That whole kind of techno-optimism of the late 20th century has just been completely turned on its head.
So what do you think, did anything change in terms of, if you compare it to how you would write the story before you try to bring in these themes? Have you developed any narrative techniques? What have you been doing to try to, because you do write a novel about it, even though in The Great Arrangement you discuss the difficulties of doing so?
In The Great Derangement, I talked about, the specific sorts of challenges that the novel as a form presents, when you're trying to deal with this particular moment. And certainly, Gun Island was a kind of response to my own ideas in The Great Derangement. So look at the things that I think if you're going to write a novel about the world today, the first thing is it can't be a novel about a single place, because these things are unfolding all around us, in these kind of catastrophic ways. I mean, one of the things that the planetary crisis really represents is the planetary nature of our existence today. We are completely interconnected. I mean, something that's happening in China, in Wuhan, suddenly has this catastrophic impact on our lives, half a planet away. So in that sense, the book, my novel, The Gun Island, is a book about, the interconnections of the world. Secondly, the reason that it's about a legend as such is because, these legends often were ways of representing human, non-human relationships. I mean, in Scandinavia, you have a very rich tradition of legends of that kind, going back to the Norse sagas and so on. If you just compare the Norse sagas with modern novels, you see the sort of enormous difference. And what is the difference, really? The difference is fundamentally that in the Norse sagas, non-humans play an enormously important part. Non-humans of every kind, animals, storms, the sea, gods, and so on. All sorts of forces find their way into the Norse sagas. So in that way, I was trying to find my way back, into other forms of storytelling, because I think that's what we have to do. We have to sort of work our way back into other earlier forms of storytelling, forms of storytelling which are not so completely tied to a sort of bourgeois idea of the regularity of the world and so on and so forth.
But on the topic of the kinds of stories that are seen as credible and serious in bourgeois culture, I'm thinking specifically about a scene in Gun Island where people who firmly believe in the power of the regularity of bourgeois life are confronted with catastrophe and apocalyptic thinking.
That scene is set in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, and it actually happened that the Getty Museum was besieged by fires. At one point they had to actually take away all the artwork and everything. I mean, the fire was literally on the boundaries of the Getty Museum. But the really weird thing is that I wrote those scenes 6 months before it actually happened. There was something so uncanny about it. And that kind of uncanniness has really sort of played itself out again and again. I mean, while writing the book, in the book, and after, writing the book. So one of the things, one of the conclusions that I come to in The Great Derangement really was that to write about this moment, to write about this planetary crisis, we have to throw ourselves into what we call the uncanny. In a sense, we are already in that uncanny valley, where we have to try and figure exactly where we are and how we got here. Uh, you know, One thing I should explain is that before I sat down to write Gun Island, I spent a lot of time in Italy meeting with refugees, because one of the sort of untold stories about this whole migration crisis is that a lot of the refugees are actually from South Asia. Many are from Bangladesh, many are from Pakistan, not so many from India, but quite a few as well. So, in certain months during 2015, 2016, 2017, actually, Bengali refugees were amongst the largest groups crossing the Mediterranean. And I became very interested in this phenomenon. I mean, I started wondering, why is it that so many young Bengalis are escaping, or trying to cross the Mediterranean, literally risking their lives at sea, making these incredible long journeys and so on. So I decided to go and actually interview refugees and migrants and so on in Italy, in the various holding camps that they have and within the migration facilities. So I spoke to many young migrants, Bengalis as well as Pakistanis, Egyptians, and so on. And it's very interesting when you speak to them, in their own languages, because I'm Bengali myself, so I could speak to the Bengali migrants in Bangla. Similarly, I could speak to the Pakistanis and Punjabis and so on in Hindi or Urdu. And so the stories that you get are actually very, very different from what you see in the newspapers. And one of the things which really struck me very forcefully is that with many of the Bengali migrants, I would ask them whether they thought of themselves as being climate refugees. That's an accepted term now. It's used a lot within the environmental justice movement and so on and so forth. I was very struck because many of them were actually very well informed about climate issues, because in Bangladesh, the government makes a big effort to inform the public about climate problems and so on. So many of them were very well informed about climate issues. And of course, many of them were, in my mind, environmental refugees, because, they had lost their lands because of the sea level rise and saltwater incursion and so on. So they actually had to abandon their land and move away, because, now rainfall is so unpredictable in Bangladesh and across South Asia that it's very hard for them to actually function as farmers anymore. But it was quite striking to me that not a single one of these migrants was willing to call themselves an environmental refugee. They just said, no, that's not what we are. And this puzzled me at first, and I thought, maybe they're just not willing to admit to it, or there's some problem here that they're not willing to accept, that they're in kind of denial about their lives and but what has actually made the move. But then I began to realize that no, for them, climate is not a separable crisis. Their travels and movements are really occasioned by the intersection of multiple crises, crises of class, feudal relations. Then there's incredible political violence sometimes, and also, there are breakdowns in families. So there's a whole range of crises that actually make them move. So, this was one of the moments when I suddenly began to realize that, what we call climate change or the climate crisis looks very different when you look at it from the point of view of an expert or, some sort of academic expert or within that framework. And when you look at it from the point of view of ordinary people, I mean, those two things are in some ways not really commensurable.
And I think that that's another dimension of that that's seen at the museum in Gun Island, where it's very evident that people who are sitting there and don't believe that the fire is going to reach them, or who think that it's not very, it doesn't sound like a likely outcome to have some kind of crisis. They are living a very cushioned existence, and they are perhaps increasingly a minority in the world. Whereas people in many other situations don't feel that a crisis is a fiction, but it's something that has already happened, that you have maybe experienced in generations with colonialism, for instance. So I think there's a difference between then how storytelling can maybe be an important, like a novel like Gun Island could participate in making people who are living this cushioned existence to see that, okay, I just read a scene in a novel that is actually right now happening in LA. And that adds to this collection of things that make you understand what's going on. But it's maybe a minority that even needs that kind of being confronted with something that's excluded from your experience. Whereas all these refugees, for instance, they already know that there is a crisis, and it's not only with the formulation of a climate crisis in climate science that it makes sense or feels real.
That's very well put, Elliot. Certainly it's the case that, ordinary people around the world understand many things that experts don't understand. But I will also say this, that actually even those minorities, the people you're speaking of as minorities who don't experience the crisis head on, are actually mistaken, because for years and years, Westerners especially have been taught that every problem will be solved by technology. So actually, one of the weird things about this, about these last 10 or 15 years, is that more and more people are actually moving into areas that are directly threatened by climate change, like Miami, for example. Miami is going to disappear. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that. And yet people are moving there in large numbers. Or you take a city like Phoenix in Arizona. Phoenix is literally, the heat levels are such that it's uninhabitable. It only became habitable after the invention of large-scale air conditioning. So to live in Phoenix, you actually have to have air conditioning. You can't live without it. You can't be outside for very long, because temperatures there are extraordinarily high, and it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And yet there are millions of people moving into exactly those areas that will soon become uninhabitable. Why are they doing that? That's an instance of the derangement that I've been talking about. Because, this crazy thing really is that, it's not like rich parts of the world are not being affected. In fact, I would say they're being disproportionately affected. You look at these last few years, the country that has perhaps been most hard hit by climate change is actually the United States. You take, just this year, there have been more than 16 $1 billion climate impacted events in the United States. You take California. California is literally becoming uninhabitable. Everybody can see it. When you have that much bad air for that long, how long can people go on living there? And it's getting worse and worse every year with these gigafires and so on. And now it's not just California, it's also Oregon and it's Washington state, And you look at what was happening in Oregon in these last few months. At the same time as you have the Black Lives Matter movement exploding in Oregon, you also have these wildfires, closing in. There you can see the sort of intersectionality of these crises. So, for a long time, climate activists have made the argument that poor people will be more badly hit. And they made this argument, I think, because they felt that they would appeal to the moral sensibilities of the rich. But if the rich had such great moral sensibilities, the world wouldn't be where it is. In fact, what they just this whole message, what it put across, to the world's privilege, is just that I don't have to worry. Let them go and die. That was literally the upshot of what this message was. And this message is actually completely wrong. I mean, look at the parts of the world that are being most affected by climate change. There's California, there's southern Texas. Houston is the fourth largest city in America, and it's the center of the global fossil fuel industry. It's the absolute hub. It's one of the richest cities in the world. Houston has been devastated over these last few years, again and again being hit by tornadoes, by these incredible floods. Hurricane Harvey, absolutely devastated Houston. You look at southeastern Australia, Victoria with the wildfires. But, it's also very striking how badly Europe has been affected. One of the worst affected countries is actually Italy. I'm just reading this very interesting book by a journalist called Stefano Liberti. It's on the cumulative effects of climate change in Italy. As far back as the 1950s, a major flood in the Po River displaced 180,000 people, 180,000 climate refugees from the Polesine area. It's in the marshlands around the Po Delta. The Po is becoming, the Po is one of the Po Valley is one of the richest parts of Europe. It's one of the major industrial areas in Europe. The Po is now becoming so unpredictable that nobody can say what the future is. There are hydrological experts in Italy who say that this entire region will not have drinking water at a certain point because of the dwindling of the glaciers. I don't know if you've been in Sicily, but in these last few years, Sicily has been incredibly badly affected. They've had wildfires, they've had these epic droughts. They can no longer farm lemons. Sicilian lemons are so famous. But now they're finding it increasingly hard to grow oranges or any kind of citrus fruits. So, Italy has been incredibly badly affected. You look at the Arctic. You look at the north of Sweden, for example. You look at these incredible wildfires that are spreading across that entire region. So, for example, the Lapps in in northern Scandinavia, they have a completely different idea of what's happening. The reindeer herds are being so badly affected, and you see this across the entire Arctic region. So, the idea that really anyone is safe is a delusion. But it's the delusion of modernity. It's the fundamental derangement of the modern era.
And so I think that the narrative you're talking about, the story of how only poor people will be affected, or poor people will be affected first, or you can buy yourself free, that's fundamentally a deranged idea. It's not true. It might be true for some time, but it's also going to be a constantly shrinking group of people who can buy themselves a bunker or a lifeboat.
Look, the first thing I would say is that, you can't set about writing a novel or writing a book with the idea of creating, as it were, an effect in the world. That is, with the idea of doing propaganda as such, I don't think, the whole idea of literature as propaganda has never worked. It didn't work in the Soviet Union. It's really never worked as such. So I wouldn't say that I wrote this Gun Island hoping to change people's minds or hoping to, as it were, create actual effects upon the world. I wrote it because, in the same way that I've written any of my other books, which is that to reflect what I see as the reality around me. I've always written from that perspective, and certainly I think not to write about these things today would be to delude oneself. It would be to become a part of the derangement. If you can't see that the reality around us is not the reality that we were in 30 years ago, then you're obviously just fooling yourself. But there again, I think the whole question of how people uh, look at the reality around us, uh, it's not very easily resolved. I would say that really those who find it hardest to accept that the catastrophic nature of what is happening in the world today are really people, urban people, middle class people, the bourgeois, in effect. I mean, those who are most deeply grounded in bourgeois life, if you like. But at the same time, there are many people who find it very easy who find it urgent, if you like, to address these issues. And of them, the best example is Pope Francis. I honestly think that the person who's thought best, most deeply, and in the most equitable way about this whole climate issue is Pope Francis. And really, his most recent encyclical, I don't know if you saw it, it's called Tutti Fratelli. Again, it's a wonderful document. I mean, it really addresses these questions of justice, injustice. Who bears the cost? How to provide really a sense of fraternity amongst peoples. So Pope Francis has single-handedly made such an enormous difference. Especially in terms of the issue of migration. So I would like to say, when I was traveling around Italy, meeting the migrants and so on, we hear a lot about the right-wing anti-migrants in Europe, and it's true, these right-wing parties are starting up in a big way. There's a huge resurgence. It's true also in the United States, and it's true also in India. There's a huge sort of a backlash against migration from certain parts into India. It's also true in South Africa. They started. There were riots against migrants in South Africa as well. So it's not a localized phenomenon by any means. But at the same time, I must say that I met many young people, old people, just ordinary people in Italy who were very sympathetic to migrants. And there are so many young Europeans risking their lives literally at sea trying to save the migrants. So we should not just tell one story about it. I mean, it's really remarkable, I would say, how many people there are in Italy and across Europe who are, doing their best, to create solidarities, And let's not forget, this kind of solidarity making would have been unthinkable 100 years ago. Can you imagine? 100 years ago, in a world ripe for fascism as it was then, if you think back to 1920, people are reaching out across races, across religions, across cultures, to create these forms of welcome and forms of solidarity. So let's not forget that story as well. I think it's very important to keep that in mind, and especially to keep it in mind in relation to other aspects of the planetary crisis. I mean, look at Greta Thunberg. The enormous appeal she's had across the world. And people just pouring out to support her. She's a very, very remarkable person, and I have the greatest admiration for her. We have to say that she's created single-handedly a kind of mass movement, if you like. And there again, you see the sort of the disaster, the catastrophe that is this pandemic, because Greta Thunberg's movement was just taking off. In January, February, March. I mean, there was so much momentum behind it, and suddenly. It all came to a sharp halt, So, this is one of the saddest things about this pandemic, I think. This is a moment when we really need to create a sense of collective action. And at just this moment, it happens that we are all stuck inside our houses, completely isolated, where to create those bonds of solidarity has suddenly become so difficult, so almost impossible, one might say. So, this is the way in which these multiple crises are sort of interacting with each other. And, catastrophe is piling upon catastrophe. One of the terrible things about this pandemic, again, is the way that, the whole climate crisis, if you like, has just suddenly surged this year. You look at these catastrophic temperatures in the Arctic. You look at the huge, the glaciers melting. The situation in Antarctica. These incredible temperatures. If you see the pictures of Siberia now, the permafrost melt, it's unbelievable. So there are just so many crises unfolding simultaneously across the planet, and it's very hard to even get one's mind around it, really.
So, I mean, in literary theory, there is a concept for when the weather is sort of reflects a character's mood. It's called the pathetic fallacy. So it's a fallacy, it's like a logical fallacy to think that there's a connection between the weather and a character. But to counter that more recently, then literary theorists like you, for instance, have challenged these ideas and thought about how maybe there are many connections, and telling those stories like legends or mythical stories.
Well, that pathetic fallacy is like one of so many ideas of so many deranged ideas that really underlie all of modern literature. Let's face it, And that's when we speak of modern literature, what are we really speaking of? We're really speaking of something that begins in the late 18th century, along with the Industrial Revolution, with the emergence of the bourgeoisie, and so on. And so, they brought into the world so many ideas that, shaped and forged modern literature. And these are the ideas that we have to completely depart from right now, We just have to completely do away with these ideas and start thinking about literary practice in an absolutely different way. But, even then, within modern literature as well, it's not all the same picture, really, I mean, if you take, for example, Knut Hamsun, Knut Hamsun's work is so much tied to landscapes, so many of his books are so responsive to, the world around him. Similarly, I would say that, for example, John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath is, a climate novel before its time. It's absolutely that. It's about migrants, and it's about migrants moving across from Oklahoma into California and their reception there. And it's really about this climate catastrophe that befell the Midwest and the Great Plains in this period. And again, it's interesting to see that, I mean, John Steinbeck himself was a, upper middle class white guy in Californian. But he went out and did research, for years. He visited these camps, he visited migrant camps, and then started writing about them, And if you look at the first chapter of Grapes of Wrath, it's really a masterpiece of climate writing. It's just it's a very short chapter, but it's incredibly powerful. So these other models also exist, and we have to remember not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, there are many very powerful tools that the novel gives us. For example, the whole business of creating scenes. So we have to, we just have to start thinking afresh, I think.
And I think that if it comes to studying literature as someone who is working at a university or studying at the university, or even going to a library and picking up a book, I think you can be attentive to all these things, like in Victorian novels, from the very core of what you're talking about, when that culture was born. There are hardly any Victorian novels from England that don't have some kind of magical, mythical element in them. So it's something that maybe it's more that literary theorists have created this fiction of what that good novel that is imagined, it has never existed. There's always been a tendency to do other things when people actually write stories and tell stories. Like Charles Dickens would be a great example, which is both a very like a realist novel writer, but also there are these fantastical coincidences that completely drive the story. And yeah, I think that there's we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, like you said, because there are so many things that have just in history writing perhaps been overwritten, but there are many more dimensions than those that are kind of seen as central in the theory that builds on this regularity of bourgeois life.
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, look at Flaubert's Madame Bovary. The last part of it is just one coincidence after another.
So thank you very much for an inspiring and interesting conversation, and scary as well, if you think about what we've actually been talking about.
Well, thank you, Elliot. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a great pleasure, and I hope someday to be there in person in the library. Thank you very much indeed.